The briefing room on Aveliri Prime had been set up for what was supposed to be a routine diplomatic meeting, the kind of standard coordination session where human military liaisons discuss joint security operations with their Aveliri counterparts. Commander Sarah Chen had attended dozens of these meetings over the 6 months she'd been serving as primary military liaison. They followed predictable patterns: review of current patrol schedules, discussion of intelligence sharing protocols, coordination about how to handle border incidents that might involve both species' security interests. But this meeting shifted dramatically in its first 5 minutes when High Councilor Verana entered the chamber. That wasn't on the schedule. Verana didn't attend routine coordination meetings. She was one of the most powerful political figures in the Aveliri government, someone who operated at strategic policy levels rather than tactical coordination. Her presence meant this had stopped being routine and had become something far more significant. Sarah felt the tension in the room ratchet up immediately. The Aveliri junior officials who'd been setting up data displays looked suddenly uncertain. Ambassador Reynolds, the senior human diplomat stationed on Aveliri Prime, straightened in his chair with visible concern. Verana surveyed the room with the kind of calm authority that came from decades of political power. Then she spoke in clear standard galactic. "This meeting will continue with reduced attendance. I need only Commander Chen, Ambassador Reynolds, General Kethros, and Colonel Seven to remain. Everyone else may be excused." The room cleared quickly, junior officials and administrative staff departing with the kind of swift efficiency that came from recognizing when powerful people wanted privacy. Once only the 5 of them remained, the briefing room felt different, more intimate, more dangerous. Verana settled into a chair with practiced grace and looked directly at Sarah. "There are concerns," she said in the carefully measured tone that Aveliri used for serious matters, "that human military operations in the Korath border region may have exceeded the parameters established by our joint security agreements." She paused, letting that statement settle. Specifically, that Commander Chen may have authorized strikes against targets that were not verified as legitimate military threats, resulting in civilian casualties that are now creating significant diplomatic complications with the Korath government. "I would appreciate clarification," Verana continued, her eyes never leaving Sarah's face, "about whether these concerns have foundation in actual events." The question hung in the air with the weight of potential career destruction, diplomatic crisis, and possibly war crimes investigation. Sarah understood immediately what was being asked beneath the diplomatic phrasing. Did you order strikes that killed civilians? Did you exceed your authority? Are you responsible for a disaster that's threatening the human Aveliri alliance? The standard response, the one her training suggested, the one Ambassador Reynolds was clearly preparing to offer, would be to deflect. Request specifics about which operations were being questioned. Suggest that accusations were based on incomplete intelligence. Create space for negotiation and face-saving compromise. Sarah saw Reynolds preparing to intervene with exactly that kind of diplomatic language. His body language suggested he was about to speak, to buy her time and create room for careful positioning. But Verana didn't give him the chance. She continued holding Sarah's gaze, didn't repeat the question, didn't elaborate or provide additional context, just maintained that steady, direct eye contact that communicated something clear. This moment required truth, not diplomacy. Sarah recognized what was happening. Verana was giving her the opportunity to answer directly, without the diplomatic filters that would normally insulate her from immediate consequences, but would also make actual truth impossible to establish clearly. It was a test, not just of Sarah's honesty, but of whether she understood what the moment required, whether she'd recognize that some situations demand stripping away all the careful protocols and just stating what actually happened. The silence extended. 3 seconds. 5. Sarah was acutely aware that everyone in the room was watching this exchange, processing what it meant that Verana was asking directly rather than through the elaborate Aveliri communication style that normally characterized such interactions. Sarah made her choice. She held Verana's gaze, didn't look away, didn't glance at Ambassador Reynolds for guidance on how to navigate this diplomatically, just met the High Councilor's eyes directly and answered, "Yes." One word. No elaboration. No defense. No explanation about the circumstances or the intelligence failures or the pressure she'd been under to act quickly in a fluid tactical situation, or any of the context that might make her decision seem more understandable or justified. Just simple acknowledgement. Yes, she had authorized those strikes. Yes, there had been civilian casualties. Yes, she had exceeded the parameters that joint security agreements had established for independent tactical operations. The effect in the room was immediate and profound. Ambassador Reynolds looked like he'd been physically struck. His entire diplomatic strategy, the careful language he'd been preparing to buy time and create space for negotiation, had just collapsed because Sarah had answered directly instead of allowing him to construct protective ambiguity. The two Aveliri military officers, General Kethros and Colonel Seven, exchanged glances that Sarah couldn't fully interpret, but that clearly indicated they were processing something unexpected. Not necessarily positive or negative, but different from what they'd anticipated. Verana's expression didn't change dramatically, but something shifted in her bearing. A kind of recognition, possibly satisfaction, that the question she'd asked had been answered with the directness she'd been testing for. The simplicity of Sarah's answer landed harder than denial or elaborate explanation could have. It was truth stated so plainly that there was no room for interpretation or negotiation or diplomatic maneuvering. Just fact, acknowledged without the cushioning that careful language usually provided. Verana was quiet for several long seconds after Sarah's answer, her gaze remaining steady and thoughtful. Then she said something that surprised everyone in the room. "Thank you for your honesty, Commander Chen. That is the foundation we need for determining how to proceed constructively." She turned to General Kethros and Colonel Seven. "Commander Chen has acknowledged responsibility for operations that exceeded joint security parameters and resulted in civilian casualties. This removes the uncertainty that would have made investigation and diplomatic resolution far more complicated and time-consuming. We know what happened. We can now focus on appropriate consequences and on preventing similar incidents rather than spending weeks trying to establish basic facts while our government's posture and position." Back to Sarah. "Your directness is appreciated even though the actions you've acknowledged will have serious consequences. You will likely face formal inquiry from your own command structure. There will be diplomatic complications that require resolution. The Korath government will demand accountability for civilian casualties. But you've made all of that significantly more straightforward by stating the truth plainly rather than forcing us to extract it through extended investigation and diplomatic negotiation." Ambassador Reynolds found his voice, though it carried strain. "High Councilor, I must emphasize that Commander Chen's acknowledgement shouldn't be taken as definitive without proper investigation of the full circumstances surrounding." "Ambassador Reynolds," Verana interrupted with polite firmness, "Commander Chen has told us the truth. Attempting to walk that back through diplomatic language that creates ambiguity would dishonor the honesty she just demonstrated. The circumstances and context absolutely matter for determining appropriate consequences, but the basic facts are now established through her direct answer. That clarity is valuable and should not be undermined." She looked back at Sarah with an expression that seemed to combine respect and curiosity. "Why did you answer so directly, Commander? You could have deflected my question. Could have requested specifics about which operations were being questioned. Could have created space for diplomatic negotiation that might have protected your career and position. Instead, you acknowledged responsibility immediately and without qualification. I'm interested in understanding why you made that choice. Sarah considered how to explain a decision she'd made in the span of perhaps 3 seconds. Because your question deserved a direct answer, she said. Because people died due to decisions I made, and trying to hide that behind diplomatic language seemed fundamentally dishonest and disrespectful to those casualties. Because I'd rather face consequences for stating the truth than avoid them through careful ambiguity that leaves everyone uncertain about what actually happened. She paused, and because I recognized what you were doing, that holding my gaze and asking plainly was creating space for truth instead of forcing diplomatic performance. Responding to that opportunity with anything other than directness seemed like betraying what you were offering, the chance to just state what happened without all the careful positioning that usually makes truth impossible to establish. Verana nodded slowly, her expression suggesting Sarah's explanation confirmed something she'd been assessing. That understanding, Verana said, that recognition of what the moment required, that demonstrates character that matters more than tactical perfection or political calculation. You made decisions that resulted in civilian casualties and exceeded your authorized parameters. That will have consequences that cannot be avoided, but you faced those consequences directly rather than trying to evade them through diplomatic maneuvering. That honesty changes everything about how we can proceed, she continued. Instead of weeks of investigation while our governments argue about what happened, we can move immediately to addressing accountability and preventing recurrence. Instead of diplomatic relations deteriorating while we fight about basic facts, we can focus on rebuilding trust and revising protocols. Your direct answer made all of that possible. She turned to Ambassador Reynolds. Ambassador, I understand your instinct to protect Commander Chen through diplomatic methods. But in this case, her choice to answer honestly serves both our governments better than extended negotiations about what actually occurred would have. Please allow her acknowledgement to stand as stated. Reynolds looked deeply uncomfortable but nodded. As you wish, High Councilor, though I will need to report this conversation to my government immediately. Of course, Verana agreed. As will I to mine. The difference is that we'll both be reporting established facts rather than competing accusations that require investigation to resolve. That is Commander Chen's gift to both our governments, clarity that makes resolution possible. The following weeks involved exactly the consequences Verana had predicted. Formal inquiry from Sarah's command structure, requiring detailed testimony about the operations in question, about the intelligence she'd relied on, about the decisions she'd made and the reasoning behind them. Diplomatic negotiations between human and Aveliri governments about accountability, and about necessary revisions to joint security protocols to prevent similar incidents. Meetings with Korath government representatives who demanded assurances that civilian casualties from military operations would be prevented through better verification procedures. Through all of it, Sarah provided complete honesty. No hiding behind classification or diplomatic immunity. No attempting to deflect blame or minimize what had happened. Just thorough testimony about what she'd done and why she'd done it, acknowledging where her judgment had failed and what consequences had resulted. The inquiry concluded with findings that Sarah had exercised poor judgment in authorizing strikes based on insufficient intelligence verification, that she had exceeded the parameters established by joint security agreements, and that her actions had resulted in civilian casualties that created significant diplomatic complications. She was relieved of her position as military liaison and reassigned to staff duties that didn't involve independent tactical authority. It was a significant professional setback, not career-ending, but definitely damaging to her advancement prospects. But it wasn't the complete destruction that war crimes charges would have represented. The honesty she demonstrated, the immediate acknowledgement of responsibility, the cooperation with investigation. All of that had mattered in determining consequences. 3 months after being reassigned, Sarah received unexpected communication. High Councilor Verana had requested a private meeting. Sarah arrived at the designated location, a small office in the Aveliri government complex, rather than any of the grand ceremonial spaces where high-level meetings usually occurred, uncertain what to expect. Verana greeted her with the formal courtesy that Aveliri protocols required, then gestured for her to sit in one of the comfortable chairs the office provided. "I wanted to speak with you personally," Verana began, "because your honest acknowledgement in that briefing room fundamentally changed how the Aveliri government approached the entire situation created by your tactical decisions. If you had deflected my question or denied responsibility," she continued, "we would have been forced to conduct extensive investigation while diplomatic relations deteriorated. We would have spent months trying to establish basic facts while both our governments postured and positioned for advantage. That process would have damaged the alliance significantly regardless of what we eventually discovered about what actually happened. Instead," Verana said, "you stated the truth plainly and immediately. That allowed us to move directly to addressing consequences and preventing recurrence rather than fighting about whether the incident even occurred as described. Your honesty made resolution possible in weeks rather than months, and made it possible without the kind of mutual recriminations and trust damage that extended investigation would have created." She leaned forward slightly. "I wanted you to know that the Aveliri leadership recognizes and values what you did, that your choice to answer honestly despite the significant personal cost demonstrates character that we respect profoundly, that you transformed a potential alliance-threatening crisis into a manageable problem through simple directness, when you could have chosen diplomatic protection that would have served your career better, but would have harmed both our governments." Sarah processed this, trying to reconcile the recognition Verana was offering with the professional consequences she'd faced. "I still made the decision that killed civilians," Sarah said quietly. "The honesty doesn't erase that or make it acceptable." "No," Verana agreed firmly. "The honesty doesn't erase your poor judgment or eliminate the consequences of your actions. Those casualties are real and terrible regardless of how you responded afterward. But your immediate acknowledgement prevented those deaths from causing even more damage through diplomatic deterioration and mutual distrust. It allowed accountability to happen cleanly rather than through extended conflict that would have harmed everyone involved. When I held your gaze and asked for truth in that briefing room," Verana explained, "I was testing whether you would recognize what the moment required, whether you'd understand that some situations demand stripping away all the diplomatic protocols and careful language, and just stating what actually happened, whether you had the character to face consequences directly rather than trying to evade them through strategic positioning." "You understood," she said. "You answered with quiet directness that cut through all the complexity and made everything else possible. That's a rare quality, the ability to choose truth over survival, to recognize when honesty serves better than protection, to face accountability directly rather than trying to deflect it through careful ambiguity. That quality," Verana concluded, "is why I wanted this meeting. To ensure you understand that the Aveliri leadership values what you demonstrated even as we held you appropriately accountable for the tactical decisions you made. That your honesty in that moment has shaped how we think about working with human military forces, about what character looks like in positions of authority, about what kind of people we want to build alliances with." Years later, when other human military officers asked Sarah about her experience on Aveliri Prime and what she'd learned from the incident that had ended her position as liaison and damaged her career prospects, she would tell them about the moment when High Councilor Verana had held her gaze and asked for truth. She didn't raise her voice, didn't threaten or demand or create pressure through aggressive questioning, just looked at me steadily and asked a question that deserved a direct answer, about whether I'd exceeded my authority and caused civilian casualties. And I recognized in that moment, Sarah would explain, that she was creating space for honesty, that responding with anything other than simple truth would be betraying the opportunity she was offering, that some moments require stripping away all the diplomatic protocols and just stating what actually happened. So I answered yes. One word, no elaboration or defense or context or explanation. Just acknowledgement of responsibility for decisions that had resulted in people dying and had exceeded the parameters I was supposed to operate within. That simple answer changed everything in the room, stripped away all the diplomatic positioning that was preparing to happen, made consequences unavoidable, but also made them clear and manageable rather than drawn out through months of investigation and mutual recrimination between our governments. Honesty as a force that reshapes power, Sarah would say. A single, unembellished answer that strips away pretense and forces everyone to deal with reality, rather than with carefully constructed versions of reality designed to protect careers and positions. I made bad decisions that killed people, she would conclude. The honesty about that doesn't erase it or make it acceptable, but it prevented those bad decisions from causing even more damage through the diplomatic deterioration and trust destruction that would have resulted from trying to hide or deflect responsibility. That's what High Councilor Verana was testing for, whether I'd choose truth even when it cost me significantly, whether I'd recognize that some moments demand directness that cuts through all the complexity, whether I had the character to face consequences rather than trying to evade them. She held my gaze and asked for truth. I gave it with a quiet yes, and that simple honesty reshaped everything that followed.